The numbers on my screen didn't make sense, and that bothered me more than the amount itself. I'm a creature of logic, of systems, of predictable inputs and outputs. As a freelance electrical engineer, my entire professional life revolves around designing and diagnosing complex circuits where every milliamp has a purpose. So, when my quarterly electricity bill for my quiet lake cabin arrived in my inbox showing a usage spike of nearly 40%, it felt like a personal affront, a glitch in the orderly matrix of my life. I was sitting at the small oak desk in my cabin's loft, the afternoon sun slanting through the high windows, the only sounds the gentle lapping of the lake against the shore, and the low hum of my laptop. This cabin was my sanctuary, a legacy from my parents, built on a plot of land that had been in my family for generations. It was a place of quiet refuge from the chaotic demands of my clients. It was also, I was beginning to suspect, the scene of a crime. My first instinct was to blame myself. Had I left the baseboard heaters on? Was the old water heater failing, drawing a constant phantom load? I spent an hour running diagnostics, checking the draw from every appliance, every circuit in the cabin. Everything was nominal. The numbers on my bill were an impossibility, an effect without a cause. And then, a memory surfaced. A vague, half-forgotten conversation from when I'd first started spending more time here last spring. It was with Brenda, the impeccably dressed and intensely assertive president of the Eagle Ridge Estates HOA, the sprawling new development of vacation homes that bordered my property. My cabin had a detached garage, a simple, sturdy structure built 50 feet from the main house. On its exterior wall, the one that faced the paved common pathway of Eagle Ridge, was a single weatherproof GFI outlet. I'd seen Brenda's golf cart parked near it a few times. I remembered bumping into her on the path one day. "Oh, Mr. Jensen," she'd said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We're so glad you're enjoying the cabin more. Just so you're aware, our landscape crew sometimes uses that outlet on your garage for their leaf blowers. It's so convenient, being right on the common path." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. A casual declaration of eminent domain over my property. At the time, I'd let it slide. The draw from a leaf blower for 10 minutes was negligible, pennies on the dollar. I was new to spending extended time here, and I didn't want to start a war with the neighbors over a rounding error. I had simply nodded and said, "Thanks for the heads up." A fatal mistake, I now realized. I hadn't given her an inch, I had given her a mile-long extension cord. That night, after the sun had set and the lights of the Eagle Ridge mansions twinkled across the water like a fleet of grounded cruise ships, I walked out to the garage. The air was cool and smelled of pine. And there it was. A thick black cable snaked from the outlet on my garage wall across the manicured grass verge to Brenda's pearl-white golf cart, which was parked in its own designated spot beside her sprawling home. A small, smug green light on the charger block glowed in the darkness, a silent testament to the electricity it was siphoning from my account. The anger came first, hot and sharp. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a leaf blower for 10 minutes. This was a nightly, multi-hour charge of a large electric vehicle. She was treating my property like her own personal charging station. But my anger quickly cooled, replaced by the cold, clear logic of my profession. A simple confrontation would lead to an argument. She would deny, obfuscate, and claim I had given her permission. My word against hers. No, a problem of this nature required data. It required evidence. It required a plan. The next day, my fortress of evidence began to take shape. I drove into town and purchased a top-of-the-line smart energy monitoring plug. It was a simple device. I plugged it into my GFI outlet, and then the thief, in turn, would plug their charger into it. The device connected to my cabin's...
This audio was created with Podcastle.ai.
Would plug their charger into it. The device connected to my cabin's Wi-Fi and fed real-time data directly to an app on my phone. It would tell me not just if power was being drawn, but exactly how much, down to the watt, and for how long. For the next 2 weeks, I became a silent observer. I didn't say a word to Brenda. I didn't leave a note. I simply let her continue her nightly ritual while I gathered my data. The app on my phone painted a damning picture. Every evening between 9 a.m. and 9:15 p.m., the load would spike as she plugged in the cart. The charger would draw a consistent 1.2 kilowatts for an average of 7 hours. Then, in the morning, between 7 a.m. and 7:15 a.m., the load would drop to zero. Day after day. The data was as predictable as the tides. I created a spreadsheet. I calculated the total kilowatt hours, cross-referenced the exact rate from my utility bill, and began to build an itemized invoice of her theft. The numbers were no longer trivial. It was adding up to hundreds of dollars a year. But it was never about the money. It was about the principle. It was about the arrogant assumption that my property was hers to use, that my resources were hers to consume. My plan for retribution needed to be as precise and logical as my evidence. It couldn't just be about getting her to stop. It had to be a teaching moment, a practical demonstration of cause and effect that she would never forget. And then, serendipitously, the perfect opportunity presented itself. An email arrived in my inbox. It was the monthly newsletter from the Eagle Ridge Estates HOA. It was a glossy, self-congratulatory document filled with pictures of smiling residents at a recent potluck. The headline story was about their biggest event of the year, the annual Summer Gala and Charity Fundraiser, to be held in 3 weeks at the residence of their esteemed president, Brenda. I scrolled down, my eyes scanning the details. It would be a catered, black-tie affair. Due to limited parking at her house, guests would be instructed to park in a communal lot a quarter-mile away. The newsletter then boasted, "Our esteemed president, Brenda, will be personally chauffeuring our honored guests and biggest donors from the parking area to the party in the official Eagle Ridge shuttle." The shuttle, of course, was her pearl-white golf cart. The gala was scheduled from 3 a.m. p.m. to 8 p.m., with the shuttle service beginning promptly at 3 a.m. A slow smile spread across my face. It was perfect. A public event, a reliance on her fully charged chariot, and a stage filled with her most important guests. The vague outline of a plan began to crystallize into a sharp, high-resolution schematic in my mind. The next phase of my operation required another trip to the hardware store. I didn't buy a lockbox that was too crude, too obvious. I purchased a heavy-duty, outdoor-rated smart switch, the kind used for controlling pool pumps or landscape lighting. It was a device I could wire directly to the circuit feeding the GFI outlet. And, most importantly, I could control it remotely from the same app on my phone that was monitoring the energy usage. I could, with the single tap of a button, cut all power to that outlet from anywhere in the world. Installation took less than an hour. To any outside observer, the outlet looked exactly the same. But now, it was my puppet, and I held the strings. For the next 3 weeks, I continued my silent surveillance. I let her plug in her cart every night. I watched the data stream to my phone. I watched my invoice grow. I was patient. I was methodical. The night before the gala, I watched the app as she plugged the cart in for what she believed would be its crucial pre-event charge. I saw the familiar 2 kilowatt draw begin its work. Everything was proceeding exactly as my calculations predicted. The trap was set. The stage was lit, and the star of the show had no idea that her grand performance was about to be cancelled due to a sudden, perfectly timed, and entirely deserved power outage. On my phone, I set a single calendar alert for the next day. The title was simple: Execute Plan, 3:05 a.m. p.m. The day of the gala dawned bright and painfully clear, the kind of perfect summer afternoon that event planners dream of. From the deck of my cabin, I could see the flurry of activity across the way. White tents bloomed on Brenda's expansive lawn, catering trucks were parked discreetly on the street, and the faint sound of a string quartet warming up drifted across the water. It was a scene of opulent, meticulously planned festivity. I spent the day in determined tranquility. I went for a long kayak paddle in the morning. I did some work on a schematic for a client. I read a book. But my phone was never far from my side. The app was open in the background, a silent sentinel. I watched as the golf cart completed its charge around 4 a.m. For the rest of the day, the outlet was dormant, a sleeping giant waiting for my command. At 2:45 p.m., the first guests began to arrive at the distant communal parking lot, their luxury cars glinting in the sun. I watched through a pair of binoculars from my deck. I could see the designated waiting area, where a small crowd of people in cocktail dresses and summer suits were beginning to gather, fanning themselves in the afternoon heat. At precisely 3:01 p.m., my surveillance was rewarded. The back door of Brenda's house opened, and she emerged, a vision in a flowing, cream-coloured dress and a wide-brimmed hat. She looked every bit the gracious hostess and commanding president. She began walking with a purposeful stride across her lawn, heading directly for her golf cart, which sat gleaming by the side of her house, still connected by the long black cord to my garage wall. Following her were 3 elderly couples, clearly the first of the honoured guests she intended to chauffeur. They looked hot and impatient. This was the moment, the apex of her social calendar, the nexus of her self-importance. I picked up my phone. My heart was beating a little faster now, a thrum of adrenaline and sweet, calculated vindication. I watched her on the screen of my binoculars as I navigated the app with my thumb. She was about 10 feet from the cart. I pressed the large virtual button on my screen labelled Garage Outlet. The icon switched from a green onto a grey OFF. A small confirmation popped up. Outlet power deactivated. 300 yards away, the tiny green light on Brenda's charging block blinked out. I watched, holding my breath. Brenda reached the cart. She smiled regally at her guests, a gesture that said, "Behold the convenience I provide." She unplugged the heavy-duty cord from the cart's charging port. She got into the driver's seat, her guests arranging themselves on the seats behind her. She turned the key. Nothing. Not a hum, not a click. The silence was absolute. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. She turned the key again, more forcefully this time. Still nothing. Her regal smile faltered, replaced by a tight, irritated line. She got out of the cart and checked the charger, which was still plugged into the extension cord. She saw the dead indicator light. She jiggled the plug in the cord. Then, her head snapped up, her eyes scanning across the manicured lawn, past the landscaped buffer zone, directly to the wall of my garage. Her face, even from this distance, was a mask of pure fury. She said something sharp to her guests, who now looked utterly bewildered, and began storming across the grass toward my property. She wasn't walking. She was marching, her cream-coloured dress flowing behind her like a battle standard. I put my binoculars down, took a sip of my iced tea, and waited on my porch. The confrontation was now inevitable, but the terms of engagement had been set entirely by me. She arrived at the edge of my property, her face flushed, her eyes blazing. "Jensen!" she yelled.
This audio was created with podcastle.ai.
Eyes blazing. "Jensen!" she yelled, her voice shrill. "What did you do? Turn it back on. Right now. I have guests waiting." I stood up and walked calmly to the edge of my deck. "Good afternoon, Brenda," I said, my voice deliberately placid. "Is there a problem with the electricity?" "You know damn well there is. You turned off the power. You are sabotaging my party." "To be precise," I corrected gently. "I turned off the power to the outlet on my garage, which is connected to my electrical panel, and which appears on my utility bill. I'm not sabotaging your party. I've simply stopped paying for it." She stared at me, momentarily speechless. "That is a common area outlet. You have no right." "That's where you're mistaken," I said. I picked up my phone again. This was the moment for the data. I was going to approach this differently, Brenda. I was going to send you a polite letter accompanied by a detailed invoice, but I suspected that a practical demonstration might be more educational. I turned the phone screen so she could see it, even from 10 feet away. I showed her the daily usage graphs. This is the data from a smart monitor I installed 2 weeks ago. It shows a device drawing 2 kilowatts every night for 7 hours from my outlet. The usage corresponds perfectly with your routine. Her face was a mixture of rage and dawning comprehension. I switched to another screen, a spreadsheet. "And this," I continued, "is the bill. Based on the utility rate, your nightly charging has cost me approximately $287.50 over the last 6 months. That's not including the usage from before I started. Tracking it precisely. I was going to send you a bill for this amount, but since you seem to believe you have a right to my power, I thought you should first experience what it feels like when the person paying the bill decides he's no longer feeling generous." Her important guests, who had slowly wandered over to see what the commotion was, were now standing on the edge of the HOA path, well within earshot. They were staring, their expressions a mixture of shock and dawning amusement. The scene was one of total public humiliation for their esteemed president. Brenda sputtered, wordless. She had no defense. There was no argument she could make. I had facts, numbers, and the undeniable truth. She had only her own entitlement, and it had just failed her spectacularly. She gave me one last look of pure, undiluted hatred, then spun around and marched back toward her house and her stranded, important guests, her grand gala already a logistical disaster. The next morning, a sheepish-looking man I recognized as the HOA's treasurer appeared at my door. He did not make eye contact. He held out an envelope. "This is from the board," he mumbled. Inside was a check for $300, slightly more than I had calculated, and a formal, one-sentence letter of apology signed by him, not Brenda. "The board apologizes for the misunderstanding regarding the electrical outlet and has approved a project to install dedicated common area power sources," it read. I accepted the check. Later that week, I watched from my deck as a contractor dug a trench and installed a new, sturdy-looking outlet post on the far side of the path, firmly on HOA property. I never saw Brenda's golf cart plugged into it. In fact, I rarely saw Brenda at all after that. The next HOA newsletter quietly announced she had stepped back from her presidential duties to focus on other pursuits. I sat on my porch that evening, the check on the table beside me, and enjoyed the quiet hum of my own refrigerator, confident that every electron flowing through my cabin was now, finally, accounted for. The lesson had been delivered. The power was back where it belonged, with the person who paid the bill.